So let's do some throwbacks. These are fun before we get to some of the less fun stuff. But Alexander Cockburn, we like to do this. People both living and unfortunately in Cockburn's case deceased. We like to give you the best of Christopher Hitchens, emphasize the positive. We like everybody to know Cornel West and Adolph Reed, the other best people in the game. Alexander Cockburn unfortunately has passed, but he was a wit, a radical, and extremely insightful. I'm actually going back and reading some of his essay collections right now. This is him. First, we have the Friedman one. This is him back, I believe this is in 2007, I want to say, on C-SPAN, giving a really delightful explanation of the ever-embarrassing Thomas Friedman.
About Tom Friedman, though? I mean,
well, I think he irritates a lot of people on the left because he's sort of at a high voltage level of pomposity and cretinism. I mean, that his books are all nonsense. His demands.
But his book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 2 years.
Which shows there are a lot of people who are prepared to buy nonsense. I mean, you know, they buy dog food and they buy nonsense. I mean, you could prepare dog food better and you don't have to read nonsense. I mean, Friedman really is wrong about things. He's wrong in his claims about neoliberalism. He's wrong in saying the world is flat. He was wrong about the war in Iraq. He was wrong, I mean, and brutishly wrong. Not just wrong, brutishly wrong. So a lot of people, not me, I may say, spent a lot of time getting really mad at Tom Friedman, which I think sponsored the question. But he's kind of silly. I think of him like, you know, Flaubert wrote Bouvard and Pécuchet, you know, about two people endlessly spouting nonsense. And, you know, you could take Friedman on the one hand and any one of the other sort of blatherers of the mainstream pundits that occur. So that's the Friedman thing.
We have an email that came in from a 16-year-old.
I mean, a lot of props from Matt Taibbi's takedown of Friedman, but that one is even more concise.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
I love how he can move so quickly from his theories about dog food to Flaubert, too.
Well, that's what's frankly appealing about people like this is when they show themselves to be well-rounded and not like think tank gremlins or something like that.
That's one of the key differences, as well as some actual Marxism. This is Alexander Cockburn explaining that this is the depravity of the American immigration system.
Situation where you say our economy depends, not just agriculture, but, you know, construction, in whole areas. You know, we were talking about southern Kansas before the show began. You know, you can drive through southern Kansas now and you can listen to, you know, Spanish radio, because that wasn't true 20 years ago. The economy requires labor. So now you have people who have to come. Meanwhile, you then espouse economic policies south of the border, like, you know, with neoliberal reform in quotes, that destroy, let's say, Mexican agriculture, because now you drench the country under so-called free trade, free to dump, you know, Canadian and American corn in Mexico and wipe out the small peasant who can't exist. Or earlier on, you deny land reform in Honduras, in Guatemala, you know, when they tried to do it in the 50s. So gradually, you make it impossible in these southern countries for a peasantry to survive and make a go of it. You know, you suppress land reform, you support the landlords, you support the powers that be, you support the army, you wipe out all that, and what do? You get a tidal wave of people from down as far as Colombia who come up north, because it's the only way they can go. You've destroyed, and you and the clients whom you're sponsoring and helping down there, you've destroyed their conditions of life. They come north, they go to the cities, and then they go north to work. Meanwhile, you've established an economy here that requires the labor. So now you then rear up and you make your fence across the border higher and higher and higher, so the people who might have seasonally come across the border and gone back, now if they get across, they're sure as hell not going to try not to get back, because they can't get back. So you've created the conditions which require it, and then you penalize it. So how can anyone then stand there and say, I call these people illegal, as opposed to people who are rendered illegal by a system that wants their cake and wants to eat it? That's what it comes down to.
One more issue.
That's precisely it. That's it. And I love that too, because a lot of this sort of even so-called radical rhetoric on immigration right now at times kind of relies on a lot of sort of like gestures about, well, it's so much better that we live in a multicultural society. It sure as hell is. without a doubt. I have no idea why anybody would choose homogeneity over a broad, diverse society. That's frankly, just a gene and a political inclination I don't have. But the broader arguments for demilitarizing the border, for serious and fundamental labor policy change, and labor policy change to the extent of which it has anything to do with anything punitive or criminal, is waging war on Cargill and other companies that ruthlessly exploit undocumented labor in and of itself, and then as a tool to terrorize the entire labor population, connected with U.S. foreign policy. That's the foundation of it. And that's also why even like the idea of, the 20 million or so undocumented people here today, I hate even the word amnesty. It should be just immediate
welcoming.
Formalization. Yeah. I would say formalization. Let's use a dry word. These are people who live here, they pay taxes, they're terrorized by ICE, they're terrorized by law enforcement, they're footballs for racist and xenophobic politicians, they're sold out all the time by every type of politician. We formalize them immediately. You are formally in the system. And then as for the rest of it, if you are serious about it, you will be serious about stopping backing coups and military action across the globe. And you would have a serious policy against corporate exploiters, in particularly the agriculture sector. But anyways, Alexander Cockburn with perfect wit and succinctness there.
I'd also just like to add that, obviously how succinct he was is incredible. It's really important too that Alexander Cockburn, unlike a lot of other people on the left, was always very interested in doing as much outreach as possible, especially to some folks who might typically be considered to be like right-wing folks, because he recognized that a lot of people were reacting to things that they saw in the world around them, but they were being told this very false narrative. So,
right.
for example, him talking about the changes in Kansas, right? People are like, "Oh, I've seen my community change so much," and Alexander Cockburn's like, "Okay, well, here are the forces that are creating this change. Here's what they mean," rather than just saying like, "Oh, how dare you even ask a question about like why things have changed a little bit in the United States in the past like 30, 40 years." He's like,
right.
"Look, here's a story, and here's the right story instead of the right-wing story." And unfortunately, a lot of people on the left are afraid to tell the truth.
Which is ironic considering like Engels, like the condition of the working class, for instance, is just that project.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly right. Well, what do you have? You have a party who sits on the board of directors of Cargill, essentially, and they will push all of the trade and economic policies that do change Kansas, and then when somebody misappropriates the blame, because there'll always be demagogues and bigots and, of course, oligarchs who fund racist campaigns. And then someone says, hey, it changed. What's going on? Well, that Democratic Party's not going to tell them what really happened because they profit from what really happened. What they will do is talk down to them and give them moral lectures. And that's one of the things that's so disgusting about our our modern politics. It's not to say that, racism and xenophobia need to be fought tooth and nail as frankly, just even strategically, but also obviously morally, but strategically, you're not going to build any type of actual left politics without uprooting it because it's a tool of division. But you have a whole swath of people who, by the way, as I always say, back in the 90s and 80s, they were perfectly happy to play along with some of the most racist demagogic politics, not just rhetorically, but in terms of policy. Look at the immigration legislation that Bill Clinton signed in the 90s as one of many examples. And then now they'll discourse wokeness. And so what does that mean? Lecture people who are on the receiving end of horrific economic forces that they aren't morally pure enough. It's disgusting, and it's not strategic.
And also recognizing what's going on in this country, just to get back to Cockburn and why he was such a phenomenal writer. He was writing a lot, for example, about the concentration of radio in the United States. And for a long time, if you drove across the United States and you turned on the radio, you'd be hearing very local stations. But in the 80s and 90s, and especially the early 2000s, those slowly started becoming bought up by smaller and smaller groups that then started pushing forward this like very right-wing narrative and being able to control the airwaves in a lot of communities, right? And he was writing about this because he was driving across the United States all the time because that was a personal interest of his. So just a great example of somebody who really was obviously a phenomenal thinker, but also somebody who really was like living in this country as it is for many people instead of just sort of holding himself away somewhere.
Absolutely.
Are we saying he's like the graduate level Christopher Hitchens?
Oh, definitely.
Oh, totally. On it, like absolutely, without a doubt.
And on drinking too. He has some good lines about. He made his own cider actually on his little farm in Northern California.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think he ended up in Humboldt County. He's probably more of a weed pro than Hitchens as well.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.